Bye and Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's a pleasure to bring to you the second speaker in our series from our little ad hoc Israel Connections Committee. And tonight it's someone from an organization that I personally am very close to and has very close ties with URJ. But also the New Israel Fund, it turns out, was an organization very close to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's interesting to note that on the day before she passed away, she received the Liberty Medal from the Constitution Center right here in Philadelphia. And she designated that the proceeds from the medal should go to a number of organizations. And the New Israel Fund was one of those that she called out as being an organization that was very meaningful to her as a recipient of those funds. So tonight we have Daniel Sokatch with us. He is the CEO of New Israel Fund globally, although he's based in San Francisco. And I'm going to let him introduce himself and the organization, and please put questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. Thank you, David. Please unmute yourself.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thank you, Ben, for that introduction. It was a pleasure to join the end of your service from my room in San Francisco, where we don't have the changing leaves, but we do have and are really thankful for clean, fresh air. Which has not been a given this year. So, you know, it's funny when I spoke with, when I emailed with Ben and David, they asked if I had a connection to your area. My colleague and my deputy for public engagement was going to be your speaker, but she had to leave the country. So you're stuck with me, her boss, instead. And I thought to myself, well, other than, of course, I could make things up that are true, but they're not real connections. I have a cousin from Israel who danced in the Philadelphia Ballet Company for a few years, Amir Yogev, if you know the ballet company. But the real connection that I have to you all is that you guys are the center of the universe right now for the rest of us in this country. And you know it. And here we're not going to talk politics because I run a 501c3 and you are all a 501c3. But as the rabbi said, we're all waiting with bated breath for something to happen a week and a half from now. And here in California, in the largest state in the union, the most populous state, our fates are in your hands right now, Pennsylvania. So don't let us down, please. I'm very happy to be able to be with you tonight. And it does feel like an awesome Shabbat. The Shabbat before the most awesome Shabbat in this calendrical year. So I'm really happy to be able to have the opportunity to speak with you all tonight about Israel and the organization that I'm privileged to lead, the New Israel Fund, and about the Israelis we support as they work to build an Israel that lives up to its founding values, to be both a democratic state and also a homeland for the Jewish people. Now, as Ben said a moment ago, we received this really humbling and astonishing, beautiful honor a week ago today when I learned from the Constitution Center that Justice Ginsburg had included NIF as one of the handful of groups that she felt were most important to her, as she put it, and wanted this award divided between. And I feel like her memory and inspiration are a terrific jumping off point for us tonight to talk about something that is challenging during extremely challenging times. But I think that and forgive me for using this example, which we've all heard so much about since Justice Ginsburg passed, but the friendship she had with Justice Scalia, their ability to disagree profoundly over the most important issues that our country and our communities face and still maintain not just the civil discourse, but a warm bond of friendship is an example to us as well. Not only her inspirational, the application of her values through her work, but also the way she saw the need for positive, constructive discourse. And I think it's so important for us as a Jewish community to be able to come together to talk about hard issues, to debate them and even disagree with them, but to do so civilly and respectfully. So let me tell you a little bit about New Israel Fund. and then give you a sense of how we see things in Israel right now and why we think that's so important, especially at a time like now, even though we're so focused, all of us, on what's happening here in this country, why we think it's just as important for us to, or almost as important for us to try to focus on what's happening there. New Israel Fund was founded 41 years ago here in San Francisco. It was founded by a small group of liberal Bay Area Jews who felt that the ways of engaging with Israel that were extant back in 1979 were not in and of themselves sufficient. They knew they could write a check to the local Jewish Federation, and the Federation would give some portion of that check to the organizations in Israel, the Jewish Agency, the Joint Distribution Committee. Nothing wrong with that. I ran the Federation here in the San Francisco Bay Area for a year before I came to NIF. And they knew that they could write a check to the American Friends of the Jerusalem Zoo or the Hebrew University or the theater or the art museum, but that was not what they were looking for. They were looking for two things that were missing for them. First, they wanted to actually build a partnership with Israelis. They didn't want to just send money from abroad. They wanted to find people who felt as they did and have a real working partnership and shared goals. And what they were looking for in those Israelis were people who shared their view that what Israel needed in 1979, and it sounds funny to say this now, but in 1979, Israel had no civil society. That is, there was no rich ecosystem of organizations that represent marginalized and minority communities, that represent those who are advocating on behalf of civil and human rights, for the environment, for LGBTQ issues, for women's rights. Israel didn't have a sector like that in 1979, and the New Israel Fund set out to build that sector in Israel. And so together, these four Bay Area Jews and the expanding group of friends that they found in Israel set out to build that civil society. And their strategies for doing so were threefold. First, they would make grants. They would make grants in 6 areas. One, social and economic justice. Those organizations that are working to make sure that all Israelis are equal, both in terms of the economic situation in Israel, but also the social situation. Again, LGBTQ rights, women's issues, et cetera. They would support human and civil rights organizations working to ensure that all Israelis had their rights respected, and increasingly as time went by, to ensure that the Israeli human and civil rights organizations who monitored what was happening in the West Bank and previously Gaza also had the freedom to report to the Israeli public on what they found. They would support those organizations working to ensure that, that Israeli society was open to all Israelis. We call this our shared society work. Jews, Arabs, people from the Mizrahi and Ashkenazi community, Ethiopian and Russian immigrants, folks who are on the margins, the physical and economic periphery of the country, et cetera. We would focus on organizations within the large 22% Arab Israeli community that were working in particular to ensure that that national minority had a fair shake in the new country of Israel. We would work with organizations working for freedom of religion and for pluralism in religion. And Ben mentioned early the long relationship that the New Israel Fund has with the URJ. One of our flagship organizations is the Israel Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. We are also proud and founding supporters of Women of the Wall. And many of you know my friend Anat Hoffman, who would not let me off the hook if I didn't mention that. Finally, the 6th area that we have funded over the years, and this is a relatively new area, is what we call defense of democracy. And I'll say more about that in a minute. The second strategy that New Israel Fund employs is what we call Shatil. Shatil, which means seedling in Hebrew, is the largest nonprofit capacity builder in the state of Israel. A few years after founding the organization, NIF's founders realized that just making grants to terrific new organizations without helping those organizations figure out how to work together, how to work with boards, how to do the non-glamorous back office stuff of figuring out insurance and office space, how to build coalitions to work at City Hall to achieve their goals. These were critically important if these organizations were going to succeed. So Shatil was founded to train nonprofit staffers in a host of different areas. And today, as I said, it's Israel's largest nonprofit capacity builder. The third strategy, we're 41 years old. I celebrated my 11th anniversary this week as NIF CEO, and we still don't have a good name for it. So if any of you can come up with a good name for it, well, it's Shabbat, so you can't really win anything, but you'll win my undying thanks. We call it special projects. I know. It's not a very good one. I'll give you two quick examples. These are things that are neither grants nor shatil work that bring us closer to the goal of a fairer, more open, better, stronger, more vibrant Israel for all of its citizens. So two examples. One, Israel, like a lot of other countries, but not our country, is mad for soccer, football, right? And as in a lot of other countries, football, soccer, is not only the national passion for both Jews and Arabs, it also has too often become a battleground for all kinds of the worst tribalisms that exist in the country. Now, that's not unique to Israel. We've seen it in England, we've seen it in Belgium, we've seen it in Germany. But in Israel, the divide was often on the issue of Arabs, right? And one team in particular, I don't want to disparage them because they've made great strides, had a reputation for having racist followers who would chant all kinds of horrific things. And this was a problem in the league. So the New Israel Fund teamed up with the Israeli Football Association to create a program called Kick the Racism Out of Soccer. And it was we worked with the Football Association's training camps with kids all the way up to the professional leagues to try to create a different kind of culture in Israel where this kind of language, these kinds of chants, those kinds of attitudes were totally unacceptable on the soccer pitch and unacceptable in the society at large. And this has been an incredibly successful project. And so now I can reveal to you that team that had so many problems, Beitar Yerushalayim, is now considered to be, kosher by the football authorities in Israel because they've worked so hard to expunge that kind of awful racism from their ranks. And really, this project has succeeded beyond our wildest dreams in changing one small corner of Israel where Jews and Arabs now look at each other as fellow soccer players as opposed to opposing sides. The second example I'll give you of a special project that I'm proud of is one that we actually just wrapped up because it succeeded. After 40 years, we started a program called the NIF Law Fellows Program. And for 40 years, every year, we would select 2 up-and-coming Israeli civil rights attorneys. Usually one was Jewish, one was Arab. We would fly them to the States where the American University Washington College of Law in DC would donate an LLM, a master's degree in civil rights law. So they'd get a free master's degree. And then New Israel Fund would place these law fellows with one of our sister organizations here in the United States. And from what I've said, you can guess the kinds of organizations. We would place folks with the ACLU, with Lambda Legal Defense, with the Sierra Club, with Planned Parenthood. They would do a year of service with these organizations. They would go back to Israel where they would commit to another year working in one of our grantee organizations as attorneys. And over the almost 40 years of the span of this program, they built the civil rights bar of the state of Israel, and virtually every landmark case at the High Court of Justice, the Supreme Court of Israel, that has expanded rights for Israelis is the product of one of these law fellows taking that case up, from the case that enabled women to be fighter pilots in the IAF to the case that required the IDF to change the route of the separation barrier, the wall that was built after the Second Intifada to protect Israelis from suicide bombers. Two of our grantee organizations challenged the route of the wall, saying, we're not arguing that the wall is necessary. If the army says we need it, we need it. But the wall, as it's planned now, will divide Palestinian farmers from their land and villagers from their crop areas. And the High Court of Justice said, there's no justification for that. The army needs to build the wall in such a way that it doesn't so badly adversely impact just regular Palestinians in the West Bank trying to live their lives. To the case in 2011, I already mentioned my friend Anat Hoffman, where NIF trained lawyers and grantees went to the High Court of Justice and got a ruling banning gender segregation on public transportation. As shocking as it is to think about, women were being forced to ride on the back of the bus in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem and Bnei Brak and other places. And let me just say parenthetically, before we get depressed about this, this is the thing about the New Israel Fund that inspires me. And I should also say that long before I was the CEO, I was a donor. And right out of college in 1991, I was a volunteer with the New Israel Fund. And I lived in Israel for 2 years in the 90s during the Rabin era, and I volunteered for an NIF grantee. So I've been connected to this organization for decades. And the thing that inspires me about it is that it looks at the challenges Israel is facing. It finds the Israelis who are actually coming up with creative solutions to those problems, and it just gives them the power to make the change that they want to make for their country. And for me, there's nothing more inspirational or patriotic than being a part of that process, even though it sometimes puts you in uncomfortable positions in Israel. And in this case, our organizations went right up to the High Court of Justice, and Chief Justice Dorit Beinish, a woman, right? Lest you get too depressed that in 2011, women were in the back of the bus in Israel. There was also a Chief Justice who was a woman, which is more than we can say. And Beinish wrote in her opinion, "It's hard for me to believe that in 2011, I must rule that there is no gender segregation or indeed any segregation allowed in Israeli public transportation, but so ruled." So these are real victories. And before I move on, I have to play one of my favorite parlor games. Rabbi, you have to help me out. If Zoom is too hard for this, I'll just give you the answer. But if there's a way to do it on Zoom, I'd love to see if people can get it. So a recent case won by one of our NIF lawyers with an NIF grant from an NIF grantee, and this lawyer is now the chair of clinical studies at an Israeli law school, which is one of the reasons we wrapped up the program. Now Israel has terrific clinical programs at its law schools training lawyers. Here's the case. See if you can figure out what the issue was. The issue was segregation in a classroom. I'm going to tell you the situation, and then you tell me what was the basis of the segregation. Right? So this is an Orthodox girls' school, and the classrooms were being segregated. One type of Orthodox girl was thought to be detrimental to the learning of another type of Orthodox girl, and so they were segregated until we won the case and desegregated the school. What was the basis of the segregation?
I'm going to see if anyone wants to guess. I have you in gallery view, so I can see if anyone wants to raise their hand or if they want to put it in the chat. I have a guess, but I'm gonna let people guess first.
The rabbi's a ringer. In my experience, the rabbis get the guess right. Okay, so someone has said sexual orientation, which is an excellent guess. Incorrect, but excellent. Anyone else before the rabbi? Transgender, another great guess. Also not correct.
This is an Orthodox school, right?
That's correct.
So it would be very progressive if they.
Ethiopian is another guess, which is a really good guess. And I'm going to say, as I would have said to my daughters when they were small and we were playing one of these games, you're getting warmer. All right, bring it home, Rabbi. What was the basis?
Jeff and Ellen got it.
Yep, that's right. Someone got it. It was thought that little Mizrahi or Sephardic girls, right, girls of North African or Middle Eastern origin, would be detrimental to the ability of little white-skinned Ashkenazi girls to learn. And so they were kept in a separate classroom away from the white-skinned Ashkenazi girls. And New Israel Fund brought the case to the High Court of Justice, won a ruling. The school was forced to desegregate. It was one of the strangest moments of my tenure because there was a rally of like 10,000 ultra-Orthodox protesting the New Israel Fund. And I have to admit, I felt nothing but pride for that work, even though, again, we exist to build bridges between all parts of Israeli society. So those are a couple of good examples of the kinds of things the kinds of strategies NIF has deployed. And in 2011, just a couple of years after I started and 32 years after NIF was founded, Haaretz, Israel's leading newspaper, wrote that, quote, "There is hardly any significant socially oriented organization today in Israel that does not owe its existence to the New Israel Fund." And we're, of course, very proud of that description. But what a difference a year makes. On January 15th, 2012, the New York Times, which is one of America's leading daily newspapers, wrote that New Israel Fund is the lead organization working to promote democracy and equality in Israel. And we're very proud of that description too, but the difference between the two descriptions of New Israel Fund and our role speaks volumes about where Israel has gone and the role that New Israel Fund plays in the ongoing debate over the kind of country Israel is going to be. Today, in an Israel that is 11 years down the path of what we describe as a democracy recession, which is a path that I would argue our own country set out on about 4 years ago. NIF, as I mentioned earlier, is the equivalent of ACLU, Planned Parenthood, the Southern Poverty Law Center, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Lambda, all rolled into one. And those who criticize and sometimes even attack New Israel Fund and the organizations that we support in Israel do so from the very same place and for the very same reasons that those progressive American organizations that I just named are so often attacked and criticized by ultranationalists and xenophobes here, because it is never popular to speak truth to power. And it's never popular to hold a mirror up to your society and ask, is this who we want to be? Thus my comment about both feeling uncomfortable, but also proud at the fact that there was a massive Haredi demonstration against New Israel Fund when we desegregated that classroom. So that's a bit about who we are and why NIF is, being NIF is so challenging during these times of rising illiberalism and tribalism. Although again, in a couple of weeks, maybe the pendulum might swing again. And as I mentioned, I've been involved in NIF since I was in my early 20s, graduating from Brandeis University, looking for a way to engage with Israel that would be both fulfilling. It would fulfill both my Zionism, but also my progressive liberal American mores. And for me, NIF has been the vehicle for never having a contradiction between those two things. So why is this also complicated? Why is it that the conversation around Israel is so hard for so many of us to have? That's an important conversation in our community. Now, how many of you here saw the movie The Big Short? Remember that one? So what I remember about the movie, I'm on airplanes. I was on airplanes a lot. I have not been on an airplane since February. And between us, that is one silver lining of COVID. My work travel schedule I've missed being in Israel. I'm usually there 5 times a year. And the last trip I took was to Israel. But other than that, I'm really happy to just be here in San Francisco for a little while. So I saw The Big Short on one of the many flights I take over the course of the year. And what I remember is not so much the movie, but what I scribbled down in my notebook was a Mark Twain quote that appears on the screen at the beginning of the movie. And the quote is, "It ain't what you know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And to me, this sums up one of the challenges that we have in talking about Israel these days, whoever we are, because all of us have an idea about Israel that we have received from our own experiences and trips, our stories that we've heard, our shuls, our Sunday schools, our churches, our families, our political orientations, if we're religious and how religious we are, what we read, where we get our news. And it's especially true for us. It's especially true for the Jewish community. There's no more polarizing issue in our community right now than Israel. Someone once said, you can walk into an Orthodox synagogue and declare that you're an atheist, and you'll get less of an eyebrow raised than if you declared that you were opposed to Israel. And obviously, in my line of work, this is a very painful thing for me. It's especially painful because it's not just our Shabbat tables and our shuls and in our organizations where this issue is so contentious. Poll after poll, including one that was just released by Pew, shows that as Israel moves further and further to, I'll call it the political right, more and more young American Jews, and not just young American Jews, but liberal American Jews, move further and further away from Israel. And that vector of drift and disaffiliation away from Israel has major implications for our communal institutions and for the willingness of young American Jews, a coming generation, to connect with Israel and in fact to the Jewish community at all. And back to the Twain quote, right? The things that we think we know and that we're sure we know, part of the challenge is we don't actually know as much as we think we do. And the story that we have in our heads doesn't necessarily reflect what's actually happening on the ground. The story is very likely different from the one that you're sure about, whatever that story might be, whether you're on the left, the right, or the center. It's a very complicated place, Israel. The issues are very complicated. They're not conducive to categorizing in black and white, because when it comes to Israel, as so many of us know, it's all about the grays. So some of the things I'm saying here tonight may be difficult for some of us to hear, but I believe that we in our American Jewish community desperately need to talk and engage and work with our Israeli brothers and sisters on figuring these things out, or we risk losing something precious and vital. And to that end, I want to offer two propositions. Again, you may or may not agree. You'll have plenty of time to tell me what you think when I'm done with this part of the spiel. First of all, I personally believe that Israel is the great endeavor of the Jewish people in modern times. It's a story of redemption and salvation and almost miraculous renewal in the wake of unthinkable destruction. It's an unfolding, often messy work in progress. But the dream of a democratic Israel that offers true equality for all of its citizens, while at the same time serving as a home and a homeland for the Jewish people, is a beautiful dream. And I believe it's a dream worth fighting for. I also believe that that dream is in danger. And here, I'm not talking about the very real existential threats that Israel faces. Those are discussed often and in great detail by a host of American organizations from J Street to AIPAC and beyond, who focus on how best to deal with those challenges. I want to talk about another threat to Israel, and that's the second proposition I have for you. Look, it's a tough time for democracies out there. I mean, we know that as well as anyone in the world right now. But also in Europe, in Central and South America, in Turkey, there are threats and challenges to liberal democratic institutions and values that were unimaginable just a few years ago. And that's the case in Israel too. And I believe that Israeli democracy is in danger, and that the always fragile, carefully calibrated and recalibrated balancing act between the democratic and the Jewish aspects of Israel's identity is right now in transition and flux, and that the democratic aspect is in danger of being eroded and diminished and compromised. And I don't believe that an Israel that permanently places its Jewish character over its democratic character, and Israel has in the last 2 years legislated just that, I don't believe an Israel that pursues that path will continue to thrive and indeed survive, at least not as a place that resembles the Israel that we know and love, or as a place that a coming generation of American, Jewish, liberal young people will want to have anything to do with, much less support. Now, it's not a left-right issue. Isabel Kirshner wrote recently in the New York Times that the analysis that I just gave of the situation there isn't only held by Israel's political left, but also by right-wingers and by members of the military and security establishments. And that's a very important point. Some of New Israel Fund's most prominent supporters in Israel come from some places that you might not imagine. And brushing aside the concerns about the health of Israel's democracy that come from people like the president of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, a supporter of NIF in our sector, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the former director of the Mossad, Yuval Diskin, every single living head of the Shin Bet, former living head of the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service, and Likud icons like Dan Meridor, former Deputy Prime Minister, and Benny Begin, former minister, son of Menachem Begin, pushing their concerns about the state and health of Israel's democracy to the side, sweeping them under the rugs, is not only irresponsible, it's engaging in a self-destructive, wishful thinking and willful ignorance. And at the heart of all of the concerns that I'm articulating now, these concerns about the challenges to Israeli democracy are, I believe, two things. The first thing is the unresolved relationship between religion and state. Specifically, and this is important, I didn't say this and Ben didn't say it in his intro of me, but I'm a son of the Reform movement. I went to URJ summer camp, and here we go, I dropped out of HUC in 1994. It's true. But I had a great experience there and stayed living in Israel because of their largesse. It happens, says the rabbi. So this issue of religion and state in Israel is a burning one for me personally, and the lack of any kind of authentic indigenous Israeli decoupling of Judaism and state authority is a big threat to the democratic fiber of Israel. To paraphrase the late great Orthodox Israeli philosopher, a guy called Leibovitz, right? Yeshayahu Leibovitz said, I'm less worried about the danger Judaism can do to the state than I am about the damage that the state can do to Judaism. And this is connected, this concern, this lack of separation, it's connected in many ways to the other engine of the erosion of Israeli democracy, namely the now 53-year-old occupation of the West Bank and the settlement enterprise that Israel has engaged in since 1967, since the Six-Day War. There are now over 700,000 Israeli Jewish citizens living on the other side of the Green Line in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Now, whatever you think of it, support for and pursuit of the settlement enterprise has been the guiding political ideology and the philosophy of many of the current leaders of Israel, including the current prime minister. And this has resulted in a conceptual erasing of the Green Line, that is to say, the armistice line of 1948, between Israel and the West Bank, and an increasing normalization of the situation that exists right now in the minds of many Israelis. This despite the fact that no country in the world, not even Donald Trump's America, not even Israel, asserts that the West Bank is a part of the state of Israel. And many of us believe that this is happening at the expense of Israel's democratic character, as well as its standing in the world. And the settler lobby in Israel, which is really driving Israeli policy and is represented in many of the ministries in the state of Israel now, is unparalleled in its power and influence in Israel right now. And if you doubt this, take a look at recent statements from Israeli leaders like former Education and Defense Minister Naftali Bennett, who said a year and a half ago that there will be no Palestinian state so long as I am in the government, or this quote from the current prime minister, quote, "Occupation is nonsense. Nations respect morality up to a known limit, and they respect power much more. We reject the understanding of occupation. If the occupation were the issue, there are a number of states that have occupied other states, and no one says a word about them. Big, well-known states." Here, I will just add parenthetically that Prime Minister Netanyahu who is a very smart man, a very talented politician, sounds more and more like our president in these comments that he makes. Big, well-known states sounds very Trumpian to me. So, right, he has connections to Philly too. And we see that this issue of the settlement enterprise and fidelity to the Israeli settlements in the West Bank animates a raft of anti-democratic laws that have concerned so many Israelis, including the president of Israel, and resulted in so much damage to Israeli democracy and its reputation. Laws like the boycott law that make it a civil offense for any Israeli to call for or support a boycott of Israel or territories under Israel's control. That means it is you make yourself vulnerable to a lawsuit as an Israeli if you call for fellow Israelis not to purchase goods and products made in the settlements, or the entry law that says that if you have called for a boycott of Israel, BDS, which NIF does not support, in fact, we oppose, but we don't think it should be criminalized. But forget BDS for a minute. If you're an American Jew who has said, fellow American Jews, we shouldn't buy products from the settlements because it's dangerous for Israel's democratic future, right? Because if the settlements continue to grow, there can be no two-state solution. And then what happens? If you've made that call publicly, you can technically be denied entry into the state of Israel. Or the NGO law, which was an attempt to chill free speech by nonprofit organizations by forcing them, you can't make this up, to first report their funding from foreign governments, which they were already required to do. And second, that would have required them to wear badges on their clothing identifying them as foreign agents. That was former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked's idea. You can imagine how well a law that forced Jewish activists to wear identification badges on their clothing went over even in conservative parts of Israel. And that one got dumped pretty quickly. But there was also one called the Nakba law. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic, and that's how Palestinians and Arab Israelis refer to the events of Israel's founding, 1948, the catastrophe, the dispossession of the Palestinian people. Now, up until the Netanyahu government, from the Rabin government on, Israeli textbooks had essentially taught students that there are two histories in Israel. There's the Jewish history and the Arab history. And for Jewish Israelis, the events of May 1948 were liberation and salvation. And for Arabs, they were a dispossession from their homeland. Both of these things were true. And now Israelis, Jewish and Arab, had to work together to build a shared future. And that worked pretty well. But 10 years ago, the current ruling coalition redacted those textbooks and removed any mention of the Nakba and made it an offense for any Arab school or municipality to in any way acknowledge or observe the events of 1948 as the Nakba, and the punishment for doing so would be a loss of all government funding. Finally, the most important of these bad laws was the nation state law, which passed a year and a half ago. It was intended to safeguard Israel's Jewish character. But let me just ask, how many people tonight have been to Israel, let's say in the last 72 years, right? So I go all the time. And here's the thing, that if you've been to Israel in the last 72 years, you know, as most of you have been, Israel's character, its Jewish character, is not under threat at all. Israel has a vibrant Hebrew press and culture, and there is every realization of Herzl's dream can be found on every street corner. Jewish cops, Jewish prostitutes. It's as I said earlier, in my opinion, the greatest miracle of modern Jewish history. So Israel's Jewish character is not in any way in danger. Like President Trump's wall, the nation state law of Netanyahu is a draconian solution to a problem that does not actually exist. And it's meant to do several important things. One, it's meant to provoke and play upon the fears of his base. Two, to assert Jewish primacy over both Arabs and democracy. And three, to give constitutional support for Jewish settlements, not only within Israel, new Jewish communities, but also in the West Bank. And that's why President Rivlin, who comes from the right-wing Likud party, said that if it comes to his desk, he said, if this bill is passed and comes to my desk for my official signature, I'll do it because I have to, but I'll sign it in Arabic. And that's exactly what he did. And another way to look at it is when the New Israel Fund and J Street and the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee and the Union of Reform Judaism and the Jewish Federations of North America all protest a law like the nation state law, you know it's probably not a good law. And that's exactly what happened with the nation state law, which passed. Now, if this all feels hard to swallow, think about this. The threat to previously accepted democratic norms is not unique to Israel, right? Who among us would have dreamed that in 2020, we would be discussing whether there would be a peaceful transition of power the week after next? Now, shortly after the 2016 election, I spoke at Shabbat services. It was in person at a synagogue. Actually, it was here in the Bay Area. And before I spoke, the rabbi asked the community to list their concerns about Israel. And the answers were ones that, sadly, I had gotten used to hearing in this job. People said they worried that Israel was becoming more and more hardline, ultra-religious, xenophobic. Israelis and Americans were drifting further and further apart. Israel was changing into a place that they didn't recognize anymore. And for the first time in what was then my 9 years at NIF, almost 9 years, it occurred to me that many of the worries that those congregants had about Israel could now be applied to our situation here at home. And that's pretty clear. Many of us worry that our country has moved in a direction that we don't agree with, that it's changing into a place that we don't recognize. And we'll hear what our fellow Americans have to say about that very soon now. But while this is scary, it's also a powerful reminder that when liberal, democratic, and I would argue Jewish values are threatened, when politicians present policies that are anathema to the very values upon which their countries are founded, it's not time to give up or drop out or walk away or move to New Zealand. And it's certainly not time to lower our voices. At that shul in the Bay Area, one of the congregants asked me, she was an Israeli American, whatever happened to the beautiful Israel, she said. And she was referring to this idea of Yisrael Yafa, the beautiful Israel, which is almost like a mythical ideal of an Israel that many of us once shared. And that's an ideal that seems further and further away from the reality on the ground to many people today. But here's the thing. The beautiful Israel is alive and well, and it blossoms in the places where Israelis from all backgrounds work to build a better and fairer and more open society. It exists where regular Israelis push back against the messages and the policies and the actions coming from extremists of all stripes, including too many people in power today. And NIF is the engine that supports those Israelis who work every day for that beautiful vision of their country. The beautiful Israel is NIF grantee organizations working for coexistence and shared society for all Israelis. Organizations like Sikui and the Abraham Fund initiatives that in the wake of the prime minister's statement a couple of years ago at election time that the quote, Arabs are being bussed to the polls to vote in droves, a dog whistle, wasn't really a dog whistle, just a whistle, a racist whistle to energize his base. Those organizations worked successfully to secure bilingual signage in Hebrew and in Arabic in all Israeli public transportation vehicles. And this may seem like a small thing, but it sends a big message of inclusion and belonging to the 22% of the population who are Arab citizens and who were singled out by their prime minister's remarks. And the beautiful Israel is in a new NIF grantee called Zazim, which means we're moving, which is the first Israeli affiliate of the international MoveOn.org network, which we incubated and launched just a few years ago. And at Pesach 2018, Zazim launched a successful campaign which engaged tens of thousands of Israelis, calling on Israel's commercial airline pilot and flight attendant unions to refuse to fly sub-Saharan African political asylum seekers that the government was threatening to forcibly deport to countries where their safety could not be guaranteed. There are almost 40,000 of these folks living in Israel now, and the campaign worked. Public opinion shifted. The pilots union and the flight attendant unions spoke out and said, we will not do this. We will not be party to flying people back from the Jewish state founded by refugees to places where their safety can't be guaranteed. And the beautiful Israel was in the response to the prime minister's attacks on NIF because of the funding of Zazim that did that terrific campaign, and because of our opposition to the nation state law. And in response, we had what my Israeli staff calls the Bibi bump. Thousands of Israelis joined the ranks of the New Israel Fund, including former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, former Shin Bet director Carmi Gilon, and a number of other leaders who announced publicly that they were going to become donors to the New Israel Fund. And the beautiful Israel is in the tens of thousands of Israelis, including dozens of MKs who marched in Jerusalem's Pride Parade the summer before COVID after influential rabbis from the settler camp called gays and lesbians perverts. The response was tens of thousands of Israelis took to the streets. And the beautiful Israel is in what we're seeing today. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis who, even in the face of the pandemic, are taking to the streets to protest corruption and mismanagement of the pandemic by their government. And finally, the beautiful Israel is reflected by the decision of the Anne Frank Fund to partner with NIF and all of its philanthropy in Israel because NIF reflected the Frank family's values and vision for Israel. And in RBG's wish for her prize money, as Ben said earlier, to be directed at NIF as well as a handful of other groups that reflected her values. So look, the next time the news from Israel, or for that matter, the news from here, gets you down, the next time that you feel like giving up and walking away, remember that the beautiful Israel is still there, but it needs us. There are tens of thousands of Israelis working every day to realize that vision, and they're asking us, those American Jews who refuse to choose between our liberal values and our Zionism and our passionate love for Israel, they're asking us for our partnership and our support and our commitment. And they need our help. They're asking us to speak up and stand up with them. So if you love Israel, if you care about Israel, but you're worried about where it's going, and if you want to contribute to this greatest of Jewish stories of our times, if you want your liberal American kids and grandkids to care about that place, if the vision of an Israel that reflects its founding principles really moves you, as it does me, don't succumb to despair and don't walk away. Instead, make 5781, still a new year. Make this the year that you get into the game. Make it the year in which you say out loud and as loud and clear as you possibly can to your brothers and sisters in Israel, Hineni, here I am. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Daniel. That was very inspiring, and certainly as a progressive Zionist who cares deeply about Israel, it's very heartening to hear about the work that NIF supports. I see that we're pretty much at time for the service, so Rabbi, I don't know if we can keep the lines open to allow for questions, but I certainly would like to do that. Rabbi,
yeah, that's why we concluded our service, so that
okay.
you know, it looks like some people are going off to bed, so we want to let them do that. But or you fancy European types are going off to have dinner. But yes, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box, or I think we're small enough you can just unmute.
Right.
I have a few minutes, then I'll have to go do Shabbat with my own family. But
yeah.
let's
right. It's almost time.
We didn't take that into account. Absolutely. You can tell us when.
Here you can see. Look, there's San Francisco, everybody.
Well, Daniel, one question that does, first of all, thank you everybody for attending and listening and staying with this excellent presentation. One question that does come to mind is we are already in an election process right here in this country. What can you tell us about the election process in Israel that makes addressing these issues either more challenging or easier or just different from the kinds of challenges that we might have experienced here?
Ben, that is not a softball question. Look, okay, so let's try to very quickly go over what's happened in Israel, because it's actually been as head-spinning and unprecedented in the Israeli context as our situation has been here. Israel has had 3 elections over the last year and a half, and it may well be heading to a 4th one. And that's there are a lot of reasons for that, but I'm gonna apply Occam's razor and just give the simplest, clearest explanation as to why. The reason why is because Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to get a coalition government together that will enable him to avoid having to enter into he wanted to avoid 3 criminal trials. He's been indicted on 3 criminal accounts of bribery and corruption. And the trials have begun, but now there's a question as the witness phase of the trial, right? Because you can imagine if you're called as a witness to the most powerful man in your country and he's still wielding the awesome power of head of state, it's not exactly a particularly democratic process. So the prime minister has been looking to build a coalition that will not only allow him to avoid the trial, but will actually pass a law. They call it the French law in Israel, that would give him immunity from prosecution. There's no conceit like we have in this country where a sitting president, the tradition, there's no law that says it in America either, but tradition says you can't prosecute a sitting president. So that's the simplest explanation for why Israelis have gone back to the polls, or at least why they went back to the polls the first time, all the way back in, who can remember now, 1.5 years ago. But unfortunately for Mr. Netanyahu, from his perspective, he was unable to win. He thought he could win. And he couldn't win. And so they went back to the poll a second time. And once again, he couldn't win. Nobody could win. Finally, he went back to the poll a third time, this most recent election. And in this one, he actually lost. He squeaked out a loss, but he is a very canny politician. And he managed to convince Benny Gantz, the head of the Blue and White Party, to enter a coalition government. And then he worked his magic. He created, again, I'm simplifying for expediency's sake, he created a set of political circumstances that resulted in the split of the Blue and White Party, and one of the major factions left. And so Gantz is waiting to rotate to the prime ministership in a year's time. I never make predictions about Israeli politics, but I would be very surprised if that happens on the terms of that coalition agreement. And now Gantz doesn't have a party behind him anymore. He was in control of by a small margin, the largest party in Israel. He's not now. So Ben's question is important because it really illustrates the extent to which Israeli politics are so chaotic right now that the most fundamental thing, other than protecting us, right, which the Israeli government is now accused of not doing well because of COVID in the second surge in Israel, had a good first response, but it had a very bad second response. The most fundamental responsibility of a government is to pass the budget of the state so that things can keep going. They have not been able to pass a state budget. This is now years where the budget is just flipping over year to year. And this is the latest impasse that may lead Israelis to a 4th election. This is billions of shekels of public dollars spent on these elections, all for, again, I'm simplifying, but I would strongly argue that the spirit of truth is that these are vanity and desperation elections, because there's a prime minister who knows that as soon as he's out of office, he very well may go to jail. And that has been throwing Israel into political chaos for over 1.5 years. The annual budget of the New Israel Fund is about $30 million. And over the course of our 41 years of existence, we've put well over $1/3 billion into civil society organizations.
And we have a question about to what extent is Israel retaining its open border policy for refugees? How do you keep egalitarian borders? And what's the current status of that policy?
Well, even though Israel is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, Israel has not actually kept its open borders to refugees. And that is a matter of great debate within Israel and a major thrust of NIF's work and support in civil society. As I mentioned earlier, we support a number of organizations that say Israel, because of its unique history, and Israel because of its existing laws, and Israel because of its being part of the Geneva Conventions, needs to treat the refugee issue in a totally different way. Now, not unique to Israel. We are having a very similar situation in our country, and the debate is very similar. So the debate is between those people who, if I can put it bluntly, right, believe that that refugee and political asylum status should be conferred to Jewish people who come to Israel, and those who think that Israel should be a refuge for other people also who look for support. Right now, though, the conversation is temporarily moot. Israel's borders are completely shut and locked down. You need, as an American citizen, a visa to go to Israel now, proving that you're going there for some extraordinary reason and that your health situation is okay. Once you're in Israel, if you're an Israeli, you go into 2 weeks of bidud, of quarantine. Before you can even go out, which is not unique to Israel either. So there's no open borders at all right now, but I think we should be clear that Israel has not actually promoted an open border policy when it comes to refugees or political asylum seekers, in contravention with its commitments to international accords, but that there is a very large part of Israeli citizenry that is pushing back against that. Maybe I have time for one more before I'm going to get in trouble.
Okay, how else has COVID affected NIF's work?
So, look, there were two ways. One, early on in March, we recognized that we were going to face a very challenging situation, and I asked every NIF employee on both sides of the ocean and in our British affiliate, this is a couple of hundred people, we took voluntary pay cuts, starting with me at the top. I took a 40% pay cut all the way down to the people who were most junior, who took much smaller ones. We took those for 2 months. We asked our major donors to step up and help us, and they did. And we got a PPP from the Paycheck Protection Program from the feds. And all that allowed us to stabilize the ship and without cutting our grants to our grantees at all. And in Israel, we devised what we called the Crisis Action Plan. We had 3 goals during COVID. One was to ensure that the most vulnerable communities had access to the information and resources that they needed to stay safe and healthy. An example, Israel had a good, competent initial response, unlike ours, to COVID, but it didn't put out materials in Arabic or Amharic or any of the languages that refugees and immigrants spoke. So that meant that, I don't believe that was out of malice, it was out of oversight. 22% of the population that is Arab, all Ethiopian Jews who have not yet learned Hebrew, had no access to healthcare information. And so NIF organizations successfully petitioned the courts and the health ministry to change that. The second area was in making sure that we did what we could to try to prevent those who would use the cover of COVID to erode democratic norms and civil liberties, that they had a hard time doing it. On the eve of the Prime Minister's trial, which was meant to start on May 1st, the Justice Minister, you can't make it up, at 1 a.m. announced that all the Israeli the courts were going to close for a month. Criminal and civil courts were going to close for a month. So they bumped the Prime Minister's trial off. And so we and our organizations did what we could to ensure that similar attempts to sort of shut down debate. A great example is the issue of annexation. Remember that one? It went away when the UAE said, we'll have full peace with you, but you can't annex the West Bank. We don't have time to talk about that tonight, although that's an interesting one if you invite me back again. But there, we did everything we could to support those Israelis who were trying to educate their fellow country men and women about the danger, the threat that annexation would prove to Israeli democracy, and they were quite successful. And third, we had to do everything we could to ensure that there was a civil society sector when this was over. Because in addition to big groups like the Israel Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, our big flagship grantees, we support dozens and dozens of wonderful little groups, Ethiopian Israeli advocacy groups, Bedouin women collectives trying to give themselves economic autonomy from their patriarchal society, LGBTQ centers in Tel Aviv and in small towns around Israel, things that really could be submerged in the tidal wave of economic destruction that the pandemic wrought. And we have been dedicated to making sure that they have what they need to try to survive what is an unprecedentedly challenging period.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much. This has really been so interesting, and this must be an incredibly busy time for you. So thank you for taking time out of your work day and your personal day to speak to us. And we will certainly track the NIF and how it's doing in the future. Rabbi,
well, thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to say Shabbat Shalom to everyone, and I'm going to stop the recording.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, everyone.